guys, this is Marissa and Chris from Fortune of Nebraska. We are doing our stay-at-home version of P&L. We were asked to answer some questions, kind of our top 10 questions of 2019. And one of the ones that we get a lot is wrapped around some of the expense guidelines on the P&L. So what should this percentage be? What should my overhead for staff be? So what we thought is we would kind of team up and break this down for you. We are aware that there's a lot of stats out there in the world kind of what each one of these buckets should be. And these are our rough guidelines. We'll explain each one of them, but just know that these aren't all set in stone. We realize that every office is very different, and some may be lower and some may be a little higher depending on what your specific needs are, but these are our basics. So I will hand it over to Chris to start with our direct expenses.
Okay, so direct expenses are going to be expenses that directly affect your bottom line. They don't fluctuate a whole lot. Basically, that would include things like salaries, your lab fees, clinical supplies, office supplies, payroll taxes, things like that. One of the things that Marissa and I highly suggest you do on your P&L, you can either do it through your QuickBooks or you can do it through your accountant if you use an accountant, is to break your salaries down by area in your office. So you want to have administrative salaries, which is your front office team. You want to have assistant salaries, and then you want to have hygiene salaries, because each of those should land a little differently, and you really want to see where you are in those salaries. In general, those salaries for a general practice should run between 25 and 26% of your direct expenses, or actually of all of your income. So if you made $1 million, then we do know that about $250,000 of that $1 million is going to go toward salaries, and then breaking those down from there. Our specialists who do not have a hygiene team, we expect that to land a little bit lower, like about 20 to 22%. Okay, so we do know that that's going to hit a little bit lower. Hygiene runs between 7 and 10% of that 25%, depending on how many hygienists you have in your employ. So the other key with hygiene is your hygienists in general should be producing about 3 times their salary in their chair. So if they're paid $300 per day on average, they should be producing at least $900 per day in their chair. And we know most of our hygienists do more than that, production-wise and salary-wise, but just as a general rule, your hygienist should be producing about 3 times their salaries for that. The next direct expense that we'd like to cover right now is laboratory fees. Okay, so this can be really flexible, and we would love our lab fees if you do not have in-office ability to make your own crowns. Our lab fees should run between 7 and 10%, landing at about 9% at the very, very maximum, okay? If you're going over that, Marissa and I highly suggest you actually look into doing your own in-office work because a lot of your money is going to your lab, and you can do that much less expensively and oftentimes more beautifully than a lab can do. If you do have a CEREC or an E4D or any of those things, you should be topping out on your lab services at about 3%, maybe 4%. So outside lab, not inside lab, but outside lab. The other thing with that, which is going to tie into our next one, which is dental supplies, is please keep your CEREC blocks, anything to do with your CEREC, your burrs, anything like that that has to do with CEREC, keep that as a separate line item on your dental supply list. The other things you should really consider keeping separate are your implant parts, okay, and anything that you do with clear aligners. So if you're doing any clear aligner ortho in your practice, keep that as a separate line item, because your dental supplies, generally speaking, should be your disposables, okay? So not just disposables, obviously our burrs and things go in there, but generally you want to keep your bigger line items, separately so we can see what's going on there. Down to lab supplies should top out at 6%, and that's high. I like to see it at 4. I know Marissa likes to see it at 4, but 6%, you know, your reps are going to say, hey, 6% is a healthy number. Some will even try to inch it up from there, but we do see that lab supplies you can get a really good lab supply list at about 6%, 4 to 6%. Other things that would be in there are things like office supplies and staff promotion. Those are pretty minimal on our direct expenses, so we're not even going to really go over those, but your big ones are salaries at 25 to 26%, lab fees between 3 and 4% if you have a CEREC or an E4D, between 7 and 9% if you don't have those things, and then your clinical supplies should be topping out at 6% if you don't have any of those things. So I think Marissa is, so actually let's cover one more thing. Our direct expenses should be about 40 to 42% of all of our expenses. If it goes over that, we really need to take a good look at what's going on, but it should be right about 40 to 42%. Marissa's going to cover indirect expenses, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so indirect expenses, we know kind of falls all kinds of buckets underneath it. Typically, I say the total indirect expenses, we want those to be around 20, no more than 22% for all of the things that kind of fall under there. Major players in that bucket is advertising. We want advertising to be right around 3%. And kind of a caveat to that is if you have some really big things that you're doing with marketing that are pulling in high dollar, big cases, full mouth recon, whatever that is, your marketing may be higher than that. And if you're getting the return on investment, absolutely fine. Biggest recommendation we have is please make sure that you are tracking those marketing dollars. We are fine if we're going over that and it's bringing people in, but what we notice most around the country when we go in offices is we have new patient sources that aren't even in the computer. So we have no idea where these people are coming from. So we really truly need to make sure that we have some sort of a policy, some sort of a system that when our new patients call, they don't get through our entire new patient process without us finding out who we can thank for referring them. And that might just be our flyer or our marketing team somewhere, you know, whatever those processes were. So please make sure that that's really being followed so that you know that your 4% or your 3% is going somewhere and you can put the marketing dollars in the right places or pull back if it's not the right place. The other thing is mortgage and rent that falls in under this. The reason why we call it indirect is because your rent and your mortgage can kind of grow and even go backwards a little bit depending on CAM fees. So there's different fees for maintenance and things like that that can be stuffed in here. So it's not always one fee. I'm sure you all know that, unfortunately. But what we will say is right around 3.5% is the goal. And boy, would we all love that, right? We have seen it lower than that, very rarely, usually when people own the building and have owned it for forever. But the other piece is that we know that all throughout the country, it's either really high or really low. So right around in between 5% is really where we see it usually the healthiest. So that's something to keep in mind too. There are all kinds of other things that go under here, repairs and maintenance, taxes and licenses, you name it. Really, those are the major things that we look at under indirect expenses because those other things can kind of go up and down. What we do recommend is that you have some sort of a budget tracker in place. And we have one. If you would love it, please feel free to reach out because we're happy to share it with you. Typically what we recommend, and I know Chris talked about the clinical supplies, what we recommend is that you order every 2 weeks for your clinical supplies, which I know some offices do it once a month, some do it every week. The best possible scenario is to do it every 2 weeks. And then take the amount of collections from the previous 2 weeks and use that as your budget. So you actually put that money in the budget tracker and it tells you exactly what you can spend on CEREC, on clinical supplies, on whatever it is, even office supplies, repairs and maintenance, excuse me. So it's something that we really need to make sure that we're doing. When we're in there and just kind of spending blindly, that's when we start to get ourselves in some weird situations. So it just really is helpful to be able to look back at some of those expenses and figure out are we planning forward, or are we looking backwards and saying, oops, we spent too much this month? So I truly believe that most staff likes some sort of a budget because they don't want to spend erroneously either. They kind of get freaked out, like, I don't know what to spend, I'm not sure what to do, and they usually end up going over in those situations. So for sure, a budget tracker is a great idea. And then total expenses, I'll hand that over to Chris for the total bottom line expenses of what we look for.
So our total expenses, which is going to be our direct and our indirect expenses, in a perfect world, super healthy office, we would like to see that between 50 and 60% of your total income. That would be ideal. Now, we do have offices that Marissa and I start with that are 85%, 95%, which means the doctor's not taking anything home. So one of our goals is to not cut expenses as much as help you grow, so the expenses become a less of a percentage. So ideally, our doctors that have been with us a while do land in that 50 to 60%, 50 to 60% range, and that is the healthiest that an office can be. So really do look at your expense reports and average those out and divide it out if it isn't done for you, and find out what your total expenses are, and then start looking at it. We're here to help. You know, we're here to support you. We're here to help you walk through your P&L if that's what you'd like us to do, and just help you understand what's going on where and what can be done about those things. Do you have anything else to add, Marissa?
No, I think that's it. I think the biggest piece is so often we find docs and they are not aware exactly what each percentage is in each bucket, and they don't know even sometimes how to read a P&L. Unfortunately, that's not something we get taught in dental school. So I think the biggest piece is if you have any questions, this is your guideline to how your business is doing. It starts to tell the story like numbers do, so you don't know all the pieces of it because of your P&L, but absolutely, we have found some great things in offices and some scary things in offices just by really using the P&L as our map of how your practice is doing. This is the most important tool you can know about with your business because it truly tells you the story. And if you're really versed in it, you know exactly what's normal. You can look backwards and see what your growth is like, or you can really even look out forward and say, okay, I'm going to be really pacing more towards 20% or 30%. It's just helpful to make all the decisions about growth and whatever you need to do for your business. So definitely something I would make sure I knew back and forth if I owned my own business. Please make sure you do that. And like Chris said, reach out. We're here to help. We're completely coming from abundance on this. We want everyone to know their P&L really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all. Enjoy being home. Enjoy your gift of time, as Marissa and I would say. We have a lot of that. Work on projects in the office that you like to avoid, like maybe the P&L. You might want to look at your P&L maybe from last year, when you were while you're laid up at home. So take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and you'll see us again soon.
Have a great
Bye.
day. Thanks, guys.